about it, or states and institutions do something about it. And of course in some countries they do. They mute those tendencies to grow inequality. But the disappointment even in the Nordic countries is that universal free education, with a lot of emphasis on helping poor students from poor districts and so on at school level, hasn't really led to as much improvement in social mobility as everyone expected. Even in the Nordic countries. So while clearly an egalitarian approach to educational participation of high quality is one of the things that sustains the social equality of those countries, it would be, I think now, stretching the point to say that that's the major driver of Nordic egalitarianism. So there's a whole range of ways in which we structure education that create opportunities for differential outcomes and for the effects of social background to play out in outcomes through the agency of families. The point I made before about the drivers of participation being family social demand for position, for opportunities for the children, that being the real principal universal driver in every country, not states, not the economy, but social demand for position, now becomes very important, doesn't it? Because if you see families as active agents in all of this rather than just passive respondents to economic forces or government policy, but if you see families as active agents, then you can see those active agency playing out in patterns of investment, in independent schooling, in learning the tricks of how you get into different kinds of programs and institutions, in being able to pay higher fees if you have more money, all those different ways in which social background can lead to stratified outcomes. And the more I look at this, the more convinced I am that social background is just, inescapable. It just continues to play a major role in determining outcomes. And the game of policy is to modify it, not to abolish its effects. In the United States, stratification shows up very directly. There's a lot of data. The great thing about American higher education is so much good data about the social character of the systems. And so you can have a proper discussion about it. But in Tier 1 private universities, 64% of students are drawn from the top 10% of families. Yale estimates that only about 5% of American families can pay the sticker price, and so on. So, very simple point. Now, what we have then is a combination of trends. We have the trend to world-class universities strengthening the top layer. Everyone wants good research universities, and that of course attracts social investment as well. Good research universities are prestigious, they're attractive to top families. Top families want bend over backwards to get the children in, and so on. So you've got WCUs which tend to be, but although not universally, are dominated by middle class, upper middle class. And at the same time you've got great growth in access, but country by country very variable in quality. You could easily point to examples like Brazil and the Philippines and say there's diploma mills in huge numbers. The Indian private sector, 25,000 colleges with an average size of 500 students, unqualified teachers. They don't lead anywhere, it doesn't provide any mobility to another educational layer, and so on. This is not very effective participation, this is not empowering, this is not very good for building job skills, it's not very good for building knowledge and creating individual agency. So you can point to the problems and the weaknesses of mass education. But to some extent, the danger of impoverished mass education plays out in most countries, especially with government funding reductions and increasing dependence on private capacity. So you've got this scenario where, in a kind of neo-liberal period, I guess, in many countries, though not all countries, some evacuation of the public investment, weakening of quality through that device, a tendency to look at things like MOOCs and say, okay, that can be a substitute for providing face-to-face education in real buildings, and in some cases, and so on. And there's people in all kinds of countries. In California, trying to solve its budget problems, the governor, Jerry Brown, is convinced that MOOCs are a good substitute for normal education. Not as an adjunct, but as a substitute. So you've got this, stratification effect of growth. You've got the concentration on world-class universities and investment in those, and you've got, in many but not all countries, evacuation of equality below that going on. And this is a serious and problematic scenario. And it may have implications for the long term for the participation rate as well. Let's take the example of the United States, because it's the most important country in some ways. The top bars give you the the level of the gross tertiary enrolment ratio. That's anyone who enters an institution and enrolls formally through the administrative process, even if they leave a week later. So nearly everyone does that in the age cohort. Maybe inflated by mature age numbers, but you know, certainly we're looking at more than 4/5 entering the institutions. The red bars give you graduation at degree level. So less than half. Look at the gap. I mean, 40.1% degrees, 94.3% participation. So, and this too is an somewhat inflated figure. So the inflation factor doesn't come in, but in the comparison between the two. But more than half of the age cohort doesn't graduate. At degree level, they get a 2-year program, or they drop out, and you know, it's arguable about that their participation has created any value, because we're now at the stage in the US with a long history of participation, where community college diploma has weak power in the labour markets, and participation without a diploma has negligible power. So that's a big evacuation, a big loss of participation. In the United States in 1970, 40% of the students from the top quartile in income terms, top family income quartile, 40% got a degree by age 24. So that percentage has now gone up to 77% on the last figures, 2013. So almost twice as many, like 77% getting a degree by age 24. That's a pretty good success rate in the top quartile. Most countries will be very pleased to see that. However, it doesn't look so good when you go further down. The bottom quartile, now 9% are getting a degree by age 24, 6% are in 1970, so not much change there in the virtual elimination of the bottom quartile from the early degree stakes. Not very good in the second quartile either, so basically more than 4/5 of the age group is not getting an early degree compared to the top quartile, most people getting an early degree. Some of these people will get there in the end, but you can see the disparity in income terms. That's very striking, and the fact that it's got worse in proportional terms is a serious problem. It needs to be said, because at Oxford and Cambridge there's a sense of inevitability about independent private school middle class domination of the intake. It needs to be emphasised that at Berkeley and the other University of California system institutions, they have been able to maintain a strong role in social mobility. With Berkeley and UCLA together taking in as many Pell Grant students as the top 16 private universities put together, top 16 from Harvard down. The whole group, 16. With about 40% of Berkeley students not paying tuition on the basis of a means test, family means test, with 2/3 of students graduating with no debt. So it is possible to largely eliminate the financial problem and to ensure that, as Nick Dirk says when he goes around the world talking about Berkeley and the other University of California campuses are major engines for social mobility. In the American system, in low taxation California, in high individualistic California that invented Ronald Reagan and the New Right. So it is possible. And I have the utmost admiration for the University of California system, the way it's been able to maintain its public mission. Despite all the pressure to behave like Stanford and so on at Berkeley, people have held the line. And they still produce wonderful research outcomes. So it is possible. And so those of us who are in top institutions, I think, have got an obligation to reconsider the whole question of social access and to look at what Berkeley and the other UC campuses do, how they are able to sustain a much more representative and broader social entry than do most top institutions. And I mean, obviously Seoul National, BNU, University of Melbourne are not doing what Berkeley does. Maybe Toronto is, Glenn, I'm not sure, I haven't looked at it. Now I move to wrap up and to get more less definitive and more speculative. What really matters, I suppose, is our role in social mobility, and this is very hard to pin down. There are a lot of different figures about social mobility, and it's a notoriously difficult area. I mean, the strongest numbers on social mobility relate to intergenerational income effects, the percentage to which the child's income derives from the social background of the social income position of the father or the parents, and so on. We can also look at intergenerational comparisons on education, and that's what these OECD numbers do. Some of you will have seen these numbers before. They measure the odds ratios. On one hand, the student from a family with where the parents attended tertiary education. On the other hand, the student from the family where the parents had no tertiary education. Well, in the case of South Korea, they have about almost equal chances, the two groups, of participating in higher education. But in the case of the United States, the student from the tertiary education family has 7 times the chance of participating as a student from the non-tertiary education family. In other words, in the US, and this shows up in all the figures in the US, that bottom 20% tends to stay where it is. There's not much mobility out of that group. There's a lot more activity in the middle. Between the 40% and the 70% mark, there's a lot of movement, but there's not much movement out of the bottom 20. And there's not much dropping out of the top 20 either. But in the Nordic countries with high social mobility, the position of someone from the top 20% is more precarious. They can fall, and the position of someone from the bottom 20% is much stronger. They can rise. So social mobility is a fact, although it's hard to measure and it's hard to establish to what extent education is the driver, as opposed to all the other effects, particularly social background itself. Nominally you can use mathematical calculations to rinse out the effects of social background, but I don't find those techniques persuasive. And it's a long discussion, but I take my methodological lessons from Keynes' treatise on probability, which is a 10-year King's Fellowship dissertation, which is an invective against that kind of operation. The position of Australia and Canada, more intermediate, but Canada has better mobility figures than the other English-speaking countries. US fairly similar. The UK is worse than the UK. The UK's, if you're in the top 20% in the UK, or top 10%, you stay there pretty well. You do it through independent schooling and through a privileged route to Oxford and Cambridge and so on. But the position of people in the bottom 40% in the UK is a bit stronger than it is in some countries. They've got more chance. The point, though, to make here is that there's a strong statistical association between Gini coefficient, high inequality measures, and low mobility. That correlation is well established, and there's very little exception to it. The Korean figures are kind of confusing because some of the Korean figures show high mobility, some of them show only medium levels of mobility. The role of government is important here. In countries where there's relatively high social mobility, government plays a stronger role in taxation, through taxation and transfers, in modifying market-based income distributions. The OECD produces 2 sets of Gini coefficients, one for income before taxation and transfers, government transfers, the other for income after taxation and government transfers. The difference between them is, of course, the role of government, the extent to which it modifies inequalities generated in the market. The role of government in the Nordic countries or Germany is 35% to 40%. That is, it diminishes inequality by 35 to 40%. In the case of the United States, it's more like 25%. In Mexico, it's about 5%. In Korea, the effective government is relatively weak, only about 10%. But the initial inequality in the marketplace is low, strikingly low. So Korea comes out as a medium mobility country on those numbers anyway. But I think the East Asian pattern is different in a number of respects. In East Asia, the Korean and Taiwan examples show that you can have a relatively strong system in terms of quality because it's closely regulated by the state. You can, with high private sector numbers and a very large private fee, tuition or private cost numbers if you take into account the extra schooling outside normal schooling, tuition and extra classes. So you can have high privatisation in that sense, but you can have relatively good mobility outcomes and a relatively high standard education system across the board with very high school achievement levels as showing in PISA. So in the East Asian model, because of the family driver, because the family is so strong, the family will invest and that sustains a level of equity higher than is the case elsewhere in the world. So,
Simon, it's a question you might want to leave to later, but if you could just tell me in a sentence, and other people around the table might be able to as well, how is higher education participation for users in Korea funded?
well, Korea spends more than 10% of its total GDP on public and private investment in education. The proportion of, according to the OECD data, the proportion of higher education costs which come from the household is the highest in the region of about 72%, 73%. In the education at Atlanta is coming out in a week, so we'll have the new figures. But it's higher than Japan, which is the second highest. So you've got relatively low level of state funding. Yet you've got a fairly strong level of state regulation with the private sector constantly complaining about the level of compliance required. And you've got relatively high, very high quality student population going into universities and coming out of all systems from SNU, all institutions from SNU down to the weaker private institutions. You've probably, on an averaging basis, got a high quality of graduates. So I don't know what happens in the weaker private institutions. I don't know how strong they are, but my guess would be they're stronger than almost any counterpart weak private colleges elsewhere in the world. You may well want to enter the discussion on that. Anyway, strong relationship between inequality and low mobility. Strong relationship between equality and high mobility. Education. How much of this is due to education? That's the question. And here we revisit the human capital argument. Because the United States is where so much human capital research has been done. Thousands of studies. There's a good case. I mean, there's surge in inequality in the last 35 years, since 1980. And even just since the recession, there's been a major shift towards greater inequality. To what extent is that being driven by education? I mean, if you take the human capital argument, education creates marginal productivity, creates earnings, and you do what everyone does, and you reverse engineer that, and you say that, well, that's the earnings pattern, therefore the education's good or bad. Go backwards down the chain again. That's how everyone thinks, that's how everyone reasons about educational outcomes, about employability, all of that stuff, using it as an indicator to measure institutions and fields of study and so on. If you take that argument, then education's driving inequality. And in fact, in the inequality literature in the 90s and early 2000s, people were trying to find a way to say that it must be education, and then those arguments collapsed in the wake of the huge surge to inequality. You couldn't attribute supermanager salaries and a blowout in the top 1% to 20% to education anymore. So, and the consensus in the inequality literature now is that social background, wage determination in the workplace, taxation policy are much more important than education. So we've got the human capital equation has now been, in a major way, qualified. We haven't come to terms with what that means. But what it does mean is that the employability indicator that we're all being hung on probably shouldn't be operating the way it is. Social background might be more important than what we do in determining people's income outcomes. Certainly their starting salaries. There's a lot of literature showing that starting salaries are closely influenced by networking capability, and networking capabilities is influenced by family background. I think that we're part of a picture, we're not the driver of society, we're not the major player even. We're an important part of the mix. In some countries, education is more potent in determining effects than in others. My sense about the United States, to generalise very freely, is that it's now a reproductive system, and that's what Suzanne Mellor says in Degrees of Inequality. It's turning over a very unequal society. It's not modifying it very much. There's, in terms of people's lives, yes, there is upward mobility, and yes, there are opportunities for poor people through education. And if you took education out of the picture, everything would be worse. But it's not doing enough. It's not doing much or anything in the United States to change the patterns overall at an aggregate level. In the Nordic countries, maybe it's more important, but it's more important because it's part of a whole suite of egalitarian policies, which are ultimately driven by a state which is supported by social consensus on the nature of citizenship and rights and so on. as I said, I think social background is as big or bigger than anything that we do. And we need to come to terms with that and what it means. What I'm now really groping towards is trying to understand how we maximise the effects of higher education as a social force. I think that it works best in terms of providing opportunities for people from the bottom of society, providing social mobility, if its own institutions are very strong. That is, they're autonomous and their professional mission in terms of teaching and learning and also assessment and selection is maintained with integrity. One of the most serious trends in the present environment is the shift away from cognitive formation and towards social networking and peer networking and so on as a core aspect or core purpose of higher education. There's a very well documented American trend, which we're picking up with our emphasis on student satisfaction here, and which is beginning to evacuate quality. A related problem is when you're measuring the careers of faculty or academic staff according to their student ratings, then you find that increasingly faculty or academic staff teach down. They keep the students happy rather than challenging them. They reduce cognitive formation. The inflation of grade point averages to try and improve student satisfaction is another aspect of the same problem. The more we erode the core professional mission, the weaker our capacity to change social outcomes. The best opportunity for the poor student lies in, not in the provision of an emphasis on social capital and cultural capital where they are uncompetitive, but lies in an emphasis on cognitive formation so that hard work can get them through. It's always been the case, and it's a very basic and obvious point, but it's actually one of the things now, variables now in the mix. So issues about standards, slippery and elusive as they are really quite central to sustaining the capacity of education to provide broad upward mobility. And this is why I think you look to societies where cognitive formation at school level is really strong, where there's a very strong tradition of high quality teaching, where mathematics and language performance, as shown in PISA, is high, to understand, I think, why mobility is relatively good as well. And the two cases are the East Asian case, Korea especially, and the Nordic case. And in both those cases, but with a very different mix of social institutions and balances between public and private, you're getting this combination of good mobility outcomes with very high quality education which maintains its integrity. Very interesting. So it is possible to do it, but you need, I think, a social consensus. You can't afford to have British or Australian style independent schooling cruelling the patch, providing an avenue for the top 10% of families to invest in a special advantage. That makes a mess of it for everyone. So, as I said, it gets more flaky and more diffuse as we go, but I think more interesting. So I reflect on what we do. We form the state machine. That used to be a core role of higher education in the public mind. I think it's very important. I think maybe in China that role is understood better than it's understood now these days in the UK, but it's still very important in what we do. But it's not a front rank emphasis in the public discussion. Formation of human capital and allocation of people to jobs, that's what people think primarily is what we're doing. My argument would be, and it's a longer paper, is that we don't do this very well, but no one can do it very well. Half the people who get trained for specific jobs don't go to those jobs. Some of the jobs that require specific qualifications are not filled by people trained in those fields. Many people do generalist degrees. Often it's about position rather than about human capital, and so on. And there's great increasing differentiation in labour market outcomes for graduates. We've got a project in our new research centre which is Francis Green is looking exactly at that issue, those patterns. The third thing we do is we allocate people to social positions. Yes, we do, and I think everyone understands that's why they're in education. But I would argue that social background might matter more. It looks like we're doing it for society. We're a legitimation operation. It looks like we're doing it, but there's, what we're doing is we're providing an articulation and a filter for the effects of social background on outcomes. How much we modify it is up to us, but perhaps also up to the society and its preparedness to give us the autonomy and the institutional structures that allow merit to flourish. provision of a ladder for upward mobility and social equaliser. When we discussed high participation systems at the recent ASH conference, Glenn, in his summing up, said, maybe we're not the social equaliser we all thought we were. And I think that's the lesson, I think, of the last 50 years, that we produce this wonderful level of social participation. We've uplifted the literacy. We've provided technical and scientific skills to an enormous number of people, but we haven't provided the social equalisation that we promised to provide and that everyone thought we were going to provide. Contribution to forming civil society, I think it's of utmost importance in a country like China, which is where you have there's a wonderful state, but the civil society needs to be there to balance the state. Education is enormously important in developing that future civil society in China. But that role of education is not generally understood or discussed, except by the educators who talk about citizenship and those sorts of things. So there's something wrong about the perception of higher education and in relation to reality. All the emphasis is falling on its allocation role and particularly on its human capital functions, when there's other things that we need to be able to bring forward. So in summary, and to sign off on the presentation, high growth for the foreseeable future everywhere, except where it's already grown, almost to universal levels, but quality is entirely up in the air. Government funding continues to be a significant factor. It's less crucial in East Asia, where the family attitude to education sustains participation even in the lowest echelons, and where high quality outcomes come out of low status institutions to a greater degree than elsewhere. The role and responsibility of higher education as a central player is exaggerated, seriously exaggerated. There's a danger of neglecting the socialisation and cognitive functions. Our contribution to mobility is weaker than we thought, and in some countries it's clearly been overwhelmed by the trend to inequality. Stratification seems to be inherent in the growth, and it's also being driven by unequalising tendencies, greater competition, withdrawal of government funding, and so on. But it is possible to modify stratification, and I think that is a key to expanding the allocative social function of education, to ensure that a much larger number of institutions have reasonable status and reasonable quality, which means not pulling the top ones down, but bringing the middle ones up. I think the second and third tier is really crucial. And in UK, you'd say a strength of the UK is that the Russell Group is quite large, but a weakness in the UK is that FE is buried in the public mind in terms of status and resources. It seems to me that if you're going to raise questions of social justice, the first place to go is to not look at the boundaries of participation on the weak parts of the system, but to look at what's happening in the high demand elite institutions, to return to that question, which was historically an important question, and where there's, in this country, great work being done recently by Vicky Bolivar and Anna Knowles and John Jerram from this institution, for example, published major papers in that area recently. Graduate earnings, dispersion will get worse. Average earnings, while they'll stay above school leaver earnings, will come back to the social average. If costs keep on increasing as they are in the United States, even in the public system, then there comes a point where poorer families will say it's not worth participating anymore. The average earnings are lower than we thought, and the costs are higher. At that point, the trend to high participation may reverse, and I think that's what's happening in the United States with a fall in absolute levels of participation, as well as this weak graduation rate. So that might be a sign of things to come in other high participation systems, but this is a very unequal society, and where the private costs of higher education are blown out, so it's not necessarily representative. But that trend is a worry. I think that's where questions about over-education or maybe in fact become more manifest than they are elsewhere. To maintain a high participation society, it will be necessary to reduce stratification and particularly to lift the quality of the bottom two-thirds of the institutions. That's all I was going to say in the presentation, but we may have some discussion.
Simon, I've been asked to chair the session, which is entirely unnecessary. Perhaps I can facilitate some of the conversation. But maybe I can also start off. I've been thinking about Field's point when he started at the very beginning, and that is the assumption, we know that in some of these systems, almost all of this high participation takes place post-school, pre-career. But in others, there is a kind of notion of the umbrella of lifelong learning, the notion of individuals returning to higher education at later stages of their career, but most of which takes place in sort of high-absorbing mass institutions. I'm just wondering whether or not it's possible to argue that lifelong learning actually increases stratification within higher education. Or to put it the other way, that maybe there's greater social equity if the huge investment